Hello everyone, I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. Teresa de Jesus Cruz Rubio was supposed to walk into a room full of smiling faces. A surprise birthday party planned down to the last detail was waiting for her. Balloons swayed in the air, candles stood unlit on a cake, and family members whispered excitedly, ready to shout, "Happy birthday." But Teresa never arrived. The calls went unanswered. The minutes turned to hours. Concerns spread like wildfire among her loved ones. Something was wrong. Her sister, unable to shake the growing unease, drove to Teresa's house, expecting an explanation, a forgotten phone, a harmless delay. What she found instead would haunt her forever. Inside the home, silence hung thick, suffocating. Then she saw it. Teresa's body, and then a head. She had been decapitated. It was lying beneath a blanket, as if someone had tried to cover up the horror. Her head, severed from her body, thrown nearby. Blood was everywhere, splattered on the walls, pooled on the floor, staining the very home where she should have been safe. Officers who arrived at the scene found her lifeless body scarred with stab wounds, her abdomen, chest, and arms bearing the marks of what looked like savagery. The house was eerily still. But then they noticed something. There was water running. The shower was still on. In the sink sat a bloody kitchen knife, the murder weapon casually discarded like an afterthought. When they traced back, a call to 911 confirmed the unthinkable. The 911 caller stated a family member was inside the house, was deceased, and that the victim's head had been cut off, said Sergeant Brian Hoskin of the Glendale Police Department. There was no forced entry. Teresa had let the killer in, and the truth was more horrifying than anyone could comprehend. Her own son had done this. Alejandro David Gonzalez, just 24 hours out of jail, had murdered the woman who gave him life. But he was gone. In the quiet neighborhoods of Glendale, Arizona, life usually felt peaceful. Families went about their daily routines, kids played outside, and neighbors exchanged friendly hellos. It wasn't the kind of place where people expected anything terrible to happen. But behind the doors of one home, something truly horrifying was unfolding. Something so brutal that it shook the entire neighborhood and left everyone asking the same question. How could a son do this to his own mother? Alejandro David Gonzalez was 25 years old, jobless, and spiraling into a dark path of drugs and violence. His mother had always tried to help him, but his demons ran deep. His family had seen the warning signs in his erratic behavior, his temper, the way he seemed to be losing control. This wasn't the first time Gonzalez had been in trouble. The monster had a past. In 2021, he attacked a police officer at a Circle K, punching him so hard it chipped his tooth. That assault landed him in jail, and by 2022, he pleaded guilty. He spent nearly a year behind bars before being released, but he didn't stay out of trouble for long. Days before his mother's murder, he was arrested for breaking a window at a Fry's food gas station, a senseless act of destruction. Another sign that something inside him was unraveling. Just a day before the murder, Alejandro David Gonzalez was walking out of jail, supposedly getting a second chance. On September 26, 2024, his mother, Teresa de Jesus Cruz Rubio, was the first person waiting for him. Like any mother, she hadn't given up on her son. She picked him up, took him for lunch, and brought him back home, probably hoping that this time, things would be different. That maybe, just maybe, he'd turn his life around. She had no idea she was inviting a monster into her home. We may never know what exactly happened inside that house, what words were exchanged, what final thoughts Teresa had as the son she had raised, the son she had loved, turned on her in a drug-fueled rage. What we do know is that it wasn't a quick or merciful death. Teresa suffered multiple stab wounds, her abdomen, her chest, her arms. She fought. She must have fought. But it wasn't enough. Gonzalez didn't stop until she was gone. And then he went further. He decapitated her. When he left, he took something else with him, her burgundy GMC Yukon, the car she had been using, the one her sister had given her. It was caught on a neighbor's Ring camera, pulling away from the house in the late afternoon. He was driving away from the scene of the crime, as if nothing had happened. It didn't take long for police to track him down. When they found him, his hands and arms were covered in injuries, his clothes were stained with blood. There was no doubt. This was the man they were looking for. Sitting in the interrogation room, Alejandro David Gonzalez had a choice. Tell the truth or spin a lie. He chose the latter. Instead of taking responsibility, he fed investigators a tangled story, claiming that some mystery man he had met earlier was involved in the crime. He didn't explain who this man was, where he came from, or why he would have any reason to murder Teresa. It was a desperate attempt to shift the blame, to make it seem like he wasn't the only one responsible for what had happened. But detectives weren't buying it. As they went through the evidence, the blood-soaked crime scene, the missing kitchen knives, the surveillance footage of Alejandro leaving in his mother's car, one thing became clear. There was no other suspect, no mystery man, no accomplice, just Alejandro. Then came the confession. Gonzalez admitted to using methamphetamine that day. High, unstable, and filled with rage, he had murdered the one person who had never given up on him. For days, her loved ones mourned, searching for answers to questions that could never be fully answered. But as they grieved, the wheels of justice were turning. Then on October 7, 2024, a major development was announced. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office declared that a grand jury had officially indicted Alejandro David Gonzalez. It was no longer just a gruesome headline or a tragic loss for one family. It was now a case that would be fought in a courtroom, with justice hanging in the balance. Gonzalez was formally charged with first-degree murder, theft of means of transportation, and tampering with physical evidence. The murder charge carried the weight of his unthinkable crime, the savage killing of his own mother, a woman who had done nothing but love and care for him. The theft charge was tied to his brazen escape in the Burgundy GMC Yukon, the vehicle he had taken from the home after committing the unthinkable. And the final charge, tampering with evidence, spoke to his desperate and pitiful attempt to erase the horror of what he had done, as if a running shower and a bloody kitchen knife in the sink could wash away the monstrosity of his actions. The indictment wasn't just a legal step, it was also a promise. A promise that Teresa would not be forgotten, that her murderer, even though it was her beloved son, would face consequences. That justice, however delayed, was coming. But this was just the beginning. Alejandro sat behind bars, his bonds set at $1 million in cash, knowing that every ticking second brought him closer to the trial that would decide his fate. There would be no more meth-fueled escapes, no more lies, no more blaming some imaginary accomplice. Only the cold, hard reality of a courtroom where the truth would be laid bare. A mother is gone. A family is broken. A community is left wondering how a celebration turned into a funeral. Instead of birthday candles, there were candles at a vigil. Instead of laughter, there were tears. Instead of a mother watching her children grow, there was an empty seat at the table. And the biggest question of all remains. Why? What made Alejandro Gonzalez cross the line from troubled to monstrous? Was it the drugs? His untreated mental health issues? A darkness that had always been inside him, waiting for the right moment to strike? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain. Teresa de Jesus Cruz Rubio didn't deserve this. She deserved to blow out the candles on her cake. She deserved to hug her family. She deserved to feel love on her birthday. But instead, her life ended in horror at the hands of the very person she once held in her arms. What happened was not just a brutal crime. It was a tragedy that ran deeper than what happened that night. Alejandro David Gonzalez wasn't some faceless monster. He was a son, a man whose life had spiraled into addiction and darkness long before that final horrific act. Drugs, mental health struggles, a mother who never stopped trying to save him. It was a collision course that ended in the worst possible way, but it raises a question worth thinking. Was this fate sealed long before Teresa led him back into her home? Could something have been done earlier to stop it? Or was this always where the path was leading? Now as the courtroom waits for justice, Glendale isn't just mourning Teresa. They are mourning the loss of what could have been, a mother's life, a son's future, and the haunting reality that love alone wasn't enough to save them. Can justice ever be enough for a crime with this level of monstrosity? Story 2. The Jacobson family had everything. Wealth, success, and a beautiful home in Wellington, Florida. From the outside, they were the picture of a perfect, loving family. But if there's one thing we've learned, it's that appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the surface, hidden behind the walls of their dream home, was a story far darker than anyone could have imagined. And on what should have been a joyful birthday celebration for these two little boys, everything unraveled in the most heartbreaking way, leaving a tragedy so profound that the entire nation would never forget their names. And trust me when I say, this is the kind of case that will stay with you for days, leaving you with one haunting question. What kind of father could pull the trigger on his own family? To truly understand the story, we have to go back to 1989, when Neil Mason Jacobson first met Frankie Sue Sokoff. Their paths crossed at a gym in Bayside, Queens, New York, where they both lived and worked at the time. From the very beginning, they seemed like the perfect match, both ambitious, successful, and thriving in their careers. Frankie was making a name for herself at the prestigious Lehman Brothers, a powerhouse in the financial world, while Neil had already built his own boutique firm on Long Island. They were young, driven, and on the path to what many would call the American dream. Those who knew them spoke highly of their relationship, describing it as one built on deep admiration and affection. Frankie was completely devoted to Neil, and in return, he was seen as the charismatic, kind-hearted man who had everything going for him. Within his family and social circle, he was often regarded as the golden boy, intelligent, charming, and seemingly unstoppable. He had a way of making things work, and to everyone around him, he and Frankie appeared to be the perfect couple. It wasn't long before they took the next step, getting married and settling into Neil's home in New Jersey. Their transition into married life was effortless. Neil continued to grow his career in mortgage banking, eventually launching his own mortgage brokerage firm, while Frankie remained dedicated to her work in finance. Together, they built a comfortable and fulfilling life, filled with shared passions and adventures. They were the kind of couple who did everything together, bicycling, scuba diving, weekend getaways to the countryside, creating memories that only strengthened their bond. From the outside looking in, they had it all. But despite their seemingly perfect marriage, there was one thing missing: children. They longed to start a family. But the journey to parenthood was not an easy one. For years, they faced the devastating reality of infertility, enduring the exhausting process of multiple fertility treatments, each one bringing a wave of hope and heartbreak. It was an emotional battle, but they refused to give up. Finally, after years of waiting and struggling, their prayers were answered in 2003 when they welcomed twin boys, Joshua and Eric. Already blessed with a comfortable life, Frankie and Neil were happier than they had ever imagined. Their family felt whole, and they were thriving in both their personal and professional lives. However, there was another lingering challenge: distance. Neil's parents, Harold and Goldie Jacobson, had moved from New Jersey to Florida in the year 2000, and while they enjoyed their new home, they deeply missed being close to their son and his growing family. They often voiced their frustration about the separation, wishing they could spend more time with their grandchildren. By 2005, life took an unexpected turn for the Jacobson family when Harold was diagnosed with cancer. His condition worsened quickly, making travel to New Jersey impossible. This became a breaking point for Neil. The thought of being so far from his father during such a critical time was unbearable. Without hesitation, he made a firm decision. He was moving his family to Florida to be closer to his parents. But even before the move, Neil had already started investing in Florida real estate. He had purchased a pre-construction investment condo in Lantana, and not long after, he bought another. Real estate became somewhat of an obsession for him, and soon he found himself purchasing a third pre-construction condo. He knew he was overextending financially, but the allure of the booming market kept him going. Frankie, on the other hand, was skeptical. She voiced her concerns, questioning the practicality of his growing investments. But Neil was determined, his mind was set, and nothing was going to change it. With his properties piling up in Florida, Neil began pushing Frankie to relocate. She was resistant, hesitant to leave behind the life they had built in New Jersey. She loved their home, their community, and the stability they had created. But as time passed, the financial strain of maintaining their New Jersey home became overwhelming. The mortgage was becoming too much to handle, and eventually Frankie reluctantly agreed to the move. The Jacobsons officially settled in Florida, eager to start a new chapter close to family. However, things did not go as planned. Neil had hoped to sell their New Jersey home before the move, but the market wasn't in his favor. With no other choice, he decided to list it for rent, hoping it would at least generate some income. But just 2 months after they arrived in Florida, tragedy struck. Harold Jacobson passed away. The loss of his father devastated Neil in ways he hadn't expected. He had uprooted his entire life to be closer to Harold, only to lose him so soon after arriving. The grief weighed heavily on him, and his mother Goldie later revealed that Neil had struggled with his mental health from a young age. She recalled that as a teenager, he had been diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder, an issue that had plagued him for years. Doctors had noted that Neil had an overwhelming desire to be the perfect child, a pressure that had followed him into adulthood. As the years passed, his struggles with anxiety only grew, and soon, things took an even darker turn. The Great Recession hit Florida hard, and Neil, who worked as a mortgage broker, found himself in an increasingly difficult situation. The real estate market collapsed, and the once thriving business that had allowed him to invest so freely was now crumbling beneath him. The financial security he had worked so hard to build was slipping away, and as the weight of his losses grew heavier, so did the cracks in his once stable world. The Florida condos he had invested in before relocating were quickly turning into a financial nightmare. Burdened with subprime mortgages, their payments increased month after month, stretching his resources thin. At first, Neil had convinced himself that things would turn around. He had always been a problem solver, always found a way to make things work. But this time, no amount of determination could keep the walls from closing in. With little to no work coming in, and 4 separate mortgages draining their finances, the pressure became unbearable. At first, Neil and Frankie tried to hold on, dipping into their savings to stay afloat. But as time passed, their financial situation only worsened. Bills piled up, debt collectors began calling, and the stress of trying to keep everything together was pushing Neil to his limits. Desperate for a solution, he started making risky financial decisions, one bad choice after another, each one digging them deeper into a hole. He chased after risky investments, sought out loans, and even considered selling off what little they had left, all in a futile attempt to stop the inevitable collapse. Eventually, the weight of it all became too much to bear. The financial juggling act had run its course, and Frankie, exhausted and drained, made the painful decision to stop paying the mortgages on their 3 Florida condos. It was a move that felt like surrender, but they had no choice. There was simply no more money left to give. By the year 2008, the pressure of Neil's business failures had begun to take a serious toll on his health. At first, it started with minor complaints, aches and pains that he couldn't quite explain. But as time went on, his symptoms worsened. He became sluggish, struggling to muster the energy for even the most basic tasks. His body felt heavy, his mind clouded. There were random bouts of dizziness that left him feeling unstable. And he found himself unable to focus the way he used to. Concerned, he visited the family doctor who ordered a blood test in October. The results were troubling. Neil had elevated hormone levels, but there was no immediate explanation for his decline. As the weeks passed, his condition only worsened. The once energetic and determined man was now lethargic, withdrawn, and barely functioning. He was eventually diagnosed with depression and transient peripheral vertigo, a condition that further contributed to his constant dizziness. In an attempt to help him cope, his doctor prescribed Zoloft, a common antidepressant. Neil, desperate to feel better, took the medication as prescribed, hoping it would offer some relief. But instead of improving, his mental state deteriorated further. A few days after starting Zoloft, he was called back to the doctor's office, where they added a prescription for Xanax. It was meant to ease his anxiety, but his family and friends quickly noticed that something wasn't right. Instead of stabilizing his mood, the medication seemed to send him spiraling even further into darkness. His paranoia intensified, his emotions became more erratic, and the man they had once known began to fade before their eyes. Neil's sister, Deborah, became deeply concerned about her brother's rapid decline. She confided in their mother, worried about what he was going through. According to Deborah, Neil had started experiencing terrifying hallucinations. He had grown increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone or something was out to get him. Frankie, his wife, was just as alarmed. She reached out to her own sister, desperate for support, as Neil's behavior became more and more disturbing. He had completely withdrawn from the world. He refused to go outside, stopped engaging with friends and family, and even neglected his own hygiene. There were days when he wouldn't even shower, lost in a haze of fear and depression. His paranoia took a terrifying turn when he became obsessed with the idea that the FBI was watching him. He was convinced that federal agents were surveilling him, gathering evidence to have him arrested. He would talk about it constantly, warning anyone who would listen that they were building a case against him. His delusions became more elaborate. He was certain that his phone was tapped, that his home was under surveillance, that at any moment the authorities would storm in and take him away. His mother saw the full extent of his paranoia, one of the last times she visited him. Neil had pulled her aside, his voice shaking with fear. He told her he was in big trouble. He insisted that the FBI was coming for him, that he had done something terrible, though he couldn't seem to explain exactly what. The fear in his eyes was real, raw, and overwhelming. But before we continue, I need to ask you something. Cases like this, where someone leaves behind a trail of warning signs before doing the unthinkable, are more common than we'd like to admit. We've covered story after story where red flags were everywhere, yet somehow, no one managed to stop the disaster before it happened. So if you ever notice someone you knew showing these signs, acting strangely, withdrawing, saying things that just don't sit right, what would you do? Would you step in? Would you know what to say? I really want to hear your thoughts on this. Now back to the story. As Neil Jacobson's mind unraveled, so did his grip on reality. And on that fateful day, January 23, 2010, the darkness he had been wrestling with for months finally took over. And what happened next would shock everyone who had ever known him. That morning, Neil stood before his wardrobe, fumbling with the top shelf, his hands shaking as he retrieved a loaded gun. His wife, Frankie, still groggy from sleep, watched in confusion, not yet realizing the horror that was unfolding before her. Neil, with the gun in hand, stepped out of the wardrobe, his face hardening into something almost unrecognizable. Frankie's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. He wasn't holding the gun to defend himself. He was holding it with purpose. In an instant, panic took over. She leapt toward him, struggling desperately to wrest the weapon from his grasp. They tumbled to the floor to fight a chaotic blur of screams, desperation, and tears. In the midst of the struggle, Neil, in a violent frenzy, struck Frankie, knocking out her front tooth and slicing her finger. Despite the brutality of it all, Frankie didn't give up. She fought with all her strength, but Neil was too much, overpowering her in his disturbed state. With cold detachment, he stood, reloaded the gun, and turned the weapon on her. 2 shots rang out, one after another, each striking her in the face, silencing her forever. But Neil's twisted path didn't end there. Covered in Frankie's blood, he reloaded the gun and made his way to his son Eric's room. Eric, who had been lying on his stomach in peaceful sleep, was the next victim in the nightmare that Neil had somehow constructed in his mind. 2 bullets tore through Eric's body, but against all odds, the boy survived the first 2 shots. But Neil was undeterred, his mind fixated on finishing what he had started. He grabbed a pillow and pressed it over Eric's face, ensuring his son wouldn't survive. 2 more shots, and Eric was gone. The house was eerily still now, as Neil moved toward the next room, where his youngest son, Joshua, was sleeping. Joshua, blissfully unaware of the carnage around him, lay curled in his sheets. Neil's actions were methodical, almost as if he were following a script. He covered his son's face with a pillow, silencing him with 2 shots to the face. In a matter of moments, the vibrant life of his family had been extinguished. With the blood of his wife and children staining his hands, Neil walked to the bathroom and turned on the shower. He stood under the water, numb, as if washing away the sins he could no longer escape. When the shower ended, he dressed, swallowed a cocktail of Vicodin and Xanax, and in a haze left his home. As he drove, the pills began to take effect, making him groggy and disoriented. Less than a mile from his mother's house, passed out behind the wheel, swerving off the road and coming to a stop in the grass. In the confusion, Neil had initially planned to kill his mother, Goldie, next, before taking his own life. But in his twisted state, something inside him held him back. He later told the police that when he was at home, standing in the living room, he thought about going to heaven to be with his father. But he couldn't leave his mother alone, so he planned to take her with him. Thankfully, he never made it to her house. When the police found him, was disoriented, barely conscious, and gripping the gun beside him. As they approached, he muttered, "I killed my family," in a dazed, broken voice. The investigation raised many questions. Was Neil a victim of the side effects of his medications, or had he planned this horrific act all along? A suicide note found later suggested that Neil may have been preparing for this moment, leaving many to wonder whether he was driven by his medications, or if he had, at some point, simply snapped. And as what you might expect, from the very beginning, Neil's defense centered around his mental state. His attorneys argued that he had been suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and paranoia, all of which had been worsened by the medications he was taking. They described a man overwhelmed by financial ruin, haunted by the fear that the FBI was watching him, and convinced that there was no way out. His legal team insisted that he had not acted out of hatred or rage, but had instead been driven to an unimaginable breaking point due to the side effects of his prescription drugs. To support their argument, the defense brought in medical experts who testified about the dangers of Zoloft and Xanax, the 2 medications Neil had been prescribed before the murders. These drugs, they explained, could cause extreme mood swings, hallucinations, and suicidal tendencies, especially when taken together in high doses. Neil's behavior before the killings, his paranoia, delusions, and refusal to leave the house, was presented as clear evidence that he had lost his grip on reality. His lawyers pushed the narrative that Neil had been a loving father and husband, a man who had never shown any signs of violence before, making it hard to believe that he had killed his family intentionally. But the prosecution had a different story to tell. They painted Neil not as a victim of medication, but as a desperate man who had methodically planned the murders. They argued that his financial troubles had reached a boiling point, and that instead of facing them, he had chosen to take his family's lives in an act of ultimate control. They pointed to the way he had executed the killings, retrieving his gun, reloading it multiple times, and ensuring that no one survived. To them, this was not the act of a man lost in a haze of confusion, but one who had made a deliberate and calculated decision. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence against Neil was the suicide note found in his home. The note indicated that he had thought through his actions and accepted what he was about to do. It wasn't the frantic scribblings of someone in the middle of a psychotic episode. It was organized, reflective, and in the prosecution's view, proof of premeditation. If he had truly been unaware of his actions, why would he have left behind such a message? The prosecution also called witnesses to testify about Neil's behavior leading up to the murders. His sister Deborah had noticed a dramatic shift in his personality. He had become increasingly paranoid, talking about the FBI coming to arrest him. His wife, Frankie, had confided in her sister that Neil was no longer the man she had married. He had stopped showering, refused to leave the house, and seemed trapped in his own mind. While the defense used these accounts to argue that Neil was suffering from a mental breakdown, the prosecution used them to show that there had been warning signs that should have led Neil to seek professional help instead of resorting to murder. Neil's mother, Goldie, also played a heartbreaking role in the trial. She had been one of the last people to see him before the tragedy. When she recalled how Neil had told her, "Mom, I love you no matter what happens," the courtroom fell silent. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it, but in hindsight, it was clear. He had been preparing for what he was about to do. Goldie, who had always seen her son as a kind and loving man, struggled to reconcile the Neil she knew with the one on trial for murder. As the trial progressed, the jury was left to decide whether Neil Jacobson had truly been in a state of drug-induced psychosis, or if he had coldly and deliberately murdered his wife and children. The prosecution emphasized that Neil had made a series of conscious choices, loading his gun, aiming at his loved ones, pulling the trigger multiple times. They argued that no matter what struggles he was facing, nothing justified what he had done. The defense, on the other hand, urged the jury to consider his mental state, to see him as a broken man who had been consumed by fear, paranoia, and desperation. After days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict guilty on all counts. The judge, while acknowledging the tragedy of the situation, made it clear that no level of financial distress or mental illness excused the murder of innocent children and a devoted wife. Neil Jacobson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His fate was sealed, and the courtroom was filled with an overwhelming sense of loss. Victor and Tiffany, Neil Jacobson reached a plea deal with the state. He changed his plea of not guilty to guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. Now, after killing his family, he tried to kill himself, in fact, even leaving behind a suicide note detailing why he did it. He said the reason was the family's mounting financial situation. Now he's going to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Neil Jacobson answered to the judge in this Palm Beach County courtroom today, admitting that he shot his wife Frankie and then shot their twin 7-year-old sons while they were asleep in their Wellington home back in 2010. But when it was the family's turn to speak in court, Neil held his head and never looked up. "There's not a day that goes by that I don't hear my sister saying, 'Good morning, Sherry. Good morning, Sherry. What are you doing today? What did you eat for breakfast today? Good morning, Robin. How are you?'" Even after the trial ended, many questions remained. Could this tragedy have been prevented? If Neil had received a different treatment? Were the medications to blame? Or was he simply a man who refused to face his failures? No one could say for certain. What was undeniable, however, was that a mother and 2 young boys had lost their lives in the most horrific way possible, and nothing could ever undo that. Story 3. These 2 little boys were the perfect example of how sometimes the real danger isn't lurking outside. It's sitting right across the dinner table. On the night of November 26, 2001, a quiet evening in Cantonment, Florida erupted into chaos. A frantic 911 call sent firefighters racing to a home engulfed in flames. First responders rushed in, expecting to find a tragic accident, maybe even a desperate attempt at escape gone wrong. But as they made their way inside, what they discovered was far worse than a fire. Lying motionless on the living room floor was 40-year-old Terry King. His body was twisted unnaturally, his head bashed in with such force that his skull was shattered beyond recognition. The fire, now clearly an afterthought, had been set to cover up something much darker. Terry hadn't died in the flames. Instead, he had been murdered in cold blood. But as investigators processed the gruesome scene, they quickly realized something even more disturbing. Terry's two sons, 13-year-old Derek and 12-year-old Alex, were nowhere to be found. At first, the situation seemed like an unspeakable tragedy. A father dead, his children possibly kidnapped, or even worse, trapped inside the burning house. But the truth that unfolded over the next few hours was something no one could have expected. When authorities located Derek and Alex nearby, the boys didn't run. They didn't cry. They didn't even hesitate. Instead, they calmly confessed. They had taken a baseball bat, crept into their father's room while he slept, and repeatedly beat him until his skull caved in. And then, as if that wasn't horrifying enough, they set the house on fire in an attempt to erase their crime. At first, their reasoning seemed simple. They claimed their father was too strict, that his punishments were too harsh. Spankings, rules, a home with too many restrictions. That was why they did it, they said. But something about their confession fell off. Their words were rehearsed, their emotions strangely absent. And then, just as quickly as they had admitted to the crime, they changed their story. Now, they said they weren't acting alone. A new name surfaced. 40-year-old Ricky Chavez, a local man who had been a family friend. According to the boys, Chavez had manipulated them, convinced them to kill their father, and after the crime, took them in, washing their bloody clothes and coaching them on what to say. He had given them a place to stay, a place where they wouldn't have to follow rules or face their father's discipline. But when pressed for details, the story changed yet again. Suddenly, and Alex claimed that they never killed their father at all. Ricky Chavez had done it, they insisted. He had beaten Terry to death, then forced them to take the blame. Each new version of events contradicted the last, leaving investigators struggling to separate truth from lies. But then a chilling revelation came to light, one that would shake the case to its core. Alex revealed that his relationship with Ricky Chavez wasn't just that of a family friend. According to him, Chavez had manipulated him into believing they were in love. He described a twisted dynamic where Chavez, a grown man, had taken advantage of him, convincing him that they shared something special. With every revelation, the case became more unsettling. Was this the story of two boys rebelling against an overly strict father? Or were they victims themselves, manipulated by a predator who had used them to carry out his own dark agenda? Did you write some notes and letters about how you felt about Ricky Chavez? Yes, sir. I'm going to show you some of my market statements at the number 10 for notification purposes. Is this your handwriting? Yes, sir. Before we begin to dissect every inch of this case, let's take a moment to understand the King family first. Terry Lee King was born in Florida on April 17, 1961. He met Janet Little at a young age, and by the time Terry was 23, the two had started living together. They went on to have two sons, Derek, born in 1988, and Alex, who followed just 14 months later. Life wasn't easy for the young couple. Financial struggles weighed them down, and by the time their boys were just toddlers, things took a turn for the worse. Their relationship fell apart, but even after breaking up, Terry and Janet continued living under the same roof for about 2 years. During this time, Janet gave birth to twins fathered by another man. Despite their split, Terry attempted to co-parent all 4 children with Janet, trying to make the best of a complicated situation. But raising 4 young children with limited resources became overwhelming. Desperate for a solution, the couple turned to the Heritage Christian Academy, a church-run institution that provided shelter for struggling families. The director introduced them to the idea of open adoptions, assuring them that their children would live with new families while still staying in touch with their biological parents. Believing this was in their children's best interest, and Janet made the heartbreaking decision to give them up. Soon after, Janet moved out of Terry's home, leaving him behind to start over. Terry picked up another job, but it paid little, and he was barely getting by. 8 months later, another blow hit the family. The church shut down, unable to afford the costs of caring for the children. The 4 siblings were separated, each sent to different families across the state. Derek and Alex, once inseparable, were now miles apart. Alex, in particular, struggled. No matter how much his new family tried, he couldn't adjust. He cried endlessly, mourning the loss of his father. His distress became so unbearable that his foster parents ultimately sent him back to Terry. The boy clung to his father like a lifeline, refusing to be apart from him again. While Terry worked, Alex would sit quietly in the lunchroom, playing by himself, and at night, he made a makeshift bed by pushing two chairs together, anything just to be near his dad. Meanwhile, took a different path. As he grew older, his rebellious streak intensified. By the year 2001, Janet received a call from his foster parents. They could no longer handle him. They were at their breaking point, and just like that, Derek was sent back to Terry, reuniting with his younger brother. Around the same time, Janet had moved to Lexington, Kentucky, after marrying another man, while Terry had finally reached some stability. He had bought a rental home with a large garden, creating what seemed like a fresh start for his boys. Derek and Alex were enrolled at Ransom Middle School, and at first, things seemed to be settling down. They were bright kids, performing above average in their classes, but just as life started to resemble some kind of normalcy, everything unraveled. On November 16th, the boys vanished. Terry reported them missing, frantic with worry. Days passed, and then he received a phone call from his own children. They told him to stop looking for them, but Terry refused to give up. Frustrated by what he believed was police inaction, he even went to the local news, pleading for help. Then, on November 24th, there was a breakthrough. Derek was found wandering near a wooded area in Pace. The next day, Alex resurfaced, returning home. Neighbors saw the three of them together, preparing to leave the house to visit a friend. It looked like things might return to normal. Later that night, they came back home, but within hours, their house was engulfed in flames. Firefighters rushed to the scene, but what they found inside was far more horrifying than the fire itself. Authorities quickly pieced together the gruesome truth. The attack had happened in the dead of night. Terry had been asleep in his recliner, completely unaware that his own children were lurking in the shadows. Derek, gripping an aluminum baseball bat, struck the first blow, then another and another. It was a ruthless, frenzied assault. The man who had fought so hard to keep his sons together was left unrecognizable. His skull had been shattered. As his lifeless body lay there, the boys set the house on fire, hoping the flames would erase the evidence. But fire doesn't destroy everything. Instead of seeking help, Derek and Alex fled. They didn't go to the police or a family member. They ran straight into the arms of Ricky Chavez, a man who had been lurking in the background of their lives for some time. Chavez wasn't just a family friend. He was a convicted felon with a troubling history. While Terry had been busy working hard as a single father, Chavez had been keeping a watchful eye on his boys, offering them an escape from their strict household. His home was their hideaway, a place where rules didn't apply. Investigators soon uncovered disturbing details. Chavez had more than just a casual friendship with the boys. He had introduced them to alcohol and marijuana, blurring the lines of authority. But the most unsettling revelation came from Alex himself. He confessed that he and Chavez weren't just friends. He claimed they were lovers. Chavez had manipulated him, convinced him they were in love. Authorities found letters, love notes written by Chavez to Alex, diary entries from the young boy professing his devotion to the 40-year-old man. It was clear this was grooming, and it raised a terrifying question. Had Chavez orchestrated the murder of Terry King? To understand just how deep Chavez's influence ran, you have to understand who he was in their lives. Every neighborhood has that one house, the one where kids gather, where rules are flexible, where no one asks too many questions. For Derek and Alex, that house belonged to Ricky Chavez. To some, he was just a friendly neighbor, the guy who let kids hang out at his place, play video games, and escape their troubles. But to others, there was something unsettling about him. Rumors swirled. Over the years, multiple minors had come forward with allegations of inappropriate relationships with Chavez. Yet, somehow nothing ever stuck. As a father juggling work and raising two kids, Terry King had no idea about Chavez's past when he first allowed his sons to spend time there. As a struggling single father, he saw it as a blessing, someone willing to watch over Derek and Alex when he was working long hours. But the relationship between Chavez and the boys became too close. Prosecutors had a tangled case on their hands. Two minors accused of patricide, a felon with suspicious ties to them, and a defense riddled with inconsistencies and statements of two young, angry boys. Alex took the stand first, his testimony retelling a horrific tale. On the night of the murder, he claimed, Chavis had sneaked into the house while Terry was asleep. The brothers had been woken and led outside, told to wait in the car while Chavis carried out the evils that he had kept hidden all these years. It wasn't until they reached Chavis' home that he revealed the truth. Terry, their father, was dead. The crime, he insisted, had been for them. The alternative, he allegedly warned, was far worse. Terry would have never allowed them to live with Chavis, even if it meant taking their lives himself. As the jury absorbed the disturbing details, Derek King supported his brother's version of events, though his emotions overwhelmed him. He spoke of how Chavis had promised them a better life, a life where they would be free, taken care of, and given everything they wanted. Yet, as he tried to put into words the gravity of what had happened, his composure shattered, which revealed the confusion of a child caught in the midst of something far beyond his understanding. With the prosecution's case laid out, the defense turned its attention to one crucial element: the confession. When the boys had first been arrested, they had admitted to the crime, offering chilling descriptions of their father's final moments. The defense seized upon this and argued that their detailed account clearly showed they had been present during the attack, not waiting outside in Chavis' car as they now claimed. The jury deliberated, reaching a decision in a short time. However, the verdict was sealed, its contents hidden until the conclusion of the second trial, the one in which Alex and Derek King, still barely more than children, would stand accused of the same crime. As the trial of the King brothers commenced, the two young defendants now sat in the courtroom in their best clothes, no longer just witnesses but accused murderers. The prosecution put forth an argument backed by tangible evidence that Alex had harbored a deep resentment toward his father and had convinced his younger brother to act. The motive, they argued, lay in Alex's infatuation with Chavis, a man who had fed him fantasies of love and freedom from his evil father. This was backed by the letters that were found at the scene, one of which read something like this: "My life used to be cloudy before I made friends with Rick. My ultimate goal in life now is what is. It is about sharing your life with someone else's. Before I met Rick, I was straight, but now I am gay." Unlike before, Derek did not testify, but Alex once again took the stand. The court listened as the prosecution introduced the deeply unsettling letters written by the boy in which he described how Chavis had changed him, how he no longer saw himself as straight, how his ultimate goal in life was to be with the older man. These letters, the prosecution argued, showed the dangerous and strong influence Chavis had over Alex, an influence firm enough to push him toward murder. The defense, however, turned the focus back to Chavis. They painted him as a manipulative predator who had lured the boys into his grasp, exploiting their troubled home life and preying on their vulnerabilities. He had given them gifts, let them indulge in forbidden pleasures, and most importantly, convinced them that Terry King was the enemy. To Alex and Derek, he had been the savior they thought they needed until they were left alone to take the fall. The jury weighed the conflicting narratives carefully. Were these two boys, still so childlike in their behavior, truly capable of such a heinous crime on their own? Or had they been merely pawns in a far darker game? The final answer came swiftly. In just 5 hours, the verdict was in. Alex and Derek King were found guilty. Their knowledge of the crime seen their shifting testimonies, and their own confession ultimately convinced the jury that they had been present when their father was murdered. Yet the court also seemed to acknowledge the complexities of the case. As most children their age prepared to return to school, Alex and Derek King prepared for a very different kind of future, a future inside the walls of Florida's juvenile detention centers. They had entered the world as victims, suspects, and pawns in a deadly game, and now they would pay for a crime whose true mastermind remained a mystery in the eyes of many. In an unconventional move, the prosecution tried both Chavis and the King brothers for the same crime. Chavis was acquitted, despite the damning letters and his attempts to cover up the murder. The King brothers, however, were convicted of second-degree murder on September 6, 2002. But in yet another twist, the judge overturned their convictions, citing violations of due process. Rather than face another trial, prosecution and defense reached a plea deal. Both Derek and Alex pleaded guilty to third-degree murder. Derek was sentenced to 8 years, Alex 7, but was justice truly served? Why did nobody consider the disturbing relationship of a minor with a convicted felon? Almost nobody would ask this question. Derek and Alex King entered prison as children and left as men. Long after the trials had ended and the headlines had begun to fade, the King brothers still had those who remained invested in their fate. Among them was journalist and writer Catherine Medico, whose interest in their case had shifted from professional to deeply personal. What had started as research for a book had transformed into an emotional bond, particularly with Alex. She had spent months exchanging letters with him, their conversations stretching over long phone calls. But it wasn't until late 2002 that she finally met him in prison. From the moment they were face to face, she felt an instant connection, as though he were a child in desperate need of care. Catherine was not alone in this sentiment. In different corners of the country, strangers had been drawn to the case, outraged by the way two children had been thrust into the adult legal system. Their frustration turned into action, culminating in the formation of the King Brothers Trust in 2003. Lisa Drew Alton spearheaded the initiative, determined to provide support for the boys once they were released. It was, she believed, a gesture of faith and assurance that despite their past, would not have to navigate their future alone. Among those who became involved was Dan Daly, a widower and freelance writer from Texas. Through online discussions about the case, he had connected with Lisa, who suggested he send Derek books in prison. A simple act of kindness turned into something much more when he received a heartfelt thank you letter from the boy. That letter marked the beginning of an unexpected friendship. Over time, they corresponded frequently, and Daly made the long drive to Florida several times to visit Derek behind bars. He was struck by the boy's openness, the way he spoke about his guilt without hesitation. For Daly, the relationship was not about the notoriety of the case, but about helping a young life find direction after a tragic past. As Alex and Derek spent their formative years behind bars, these unlikely supporters waited for them on the outside. But there remained a looming question. Were the boys worth saving? Would they emerge from prison rehabilitated? Or would they become hard-hearted criminals like so many before them? When Alex King finally walked free, he did not dwell on the past. At 19, nearly a year and a half out of prison, he presented himself as someone who had left the darkness behind. He had built a new life, one he never imagined possible, with a family that embraced him as one of their own. Prison had changed him, though for years he had felt emotionally numb, disconnected from reality. The full weight of his circumstances had not sunk in until he made a reckless mistake, one that nearly cost him his freedom all over again. In April 2005, with 3 years remaining on his sentence, Alex and another inmate attempted an escape. Their plan had been amateurish at best, stuffing their beds to make it appear as though they were still sleeping, then slipping into a classroom, where they attempted to climb through the ceiling. The plan failed, and they found themselves right back where they started, caught before they even had a chance to make it beyond the walls of the facility. The consequences were severe. Arrested and booked on new charges, Alex faced the terrifying possibility of an additional 15 years behind bars. It was then that Catherine Medico rushed to see him, shaken by the news. When she expressed her worry, his response was dismissive. She wasn't his mother, he told her, but she refused to accept that. In her eyes, Alex was as much her child as her own biological children. Something in that moment shifted. The next time she received a letter from him, it was addressed simply from that day forward. He never called her anything else. Derek was released at the age of 20 in 2009 after serving 7 years. Alex was freed a year earlier, in 2008, at the age of 18. But freedom didn't guarantee a new beginning. Alex King's life had been anything but ordinary. From a troubled childhood to a high-profile murder trial, his past had always loomed over him like a shadow, could never escape. And now, at just 35 years old, his story had come to a tragic end. For years, Alex struggled with drug addiction, a battle that, according to his uncle Greg King, had consumed him. The last time Greg saw Alex was 5 years ago in Pensacola. He had urged his nephew to enter a rehab program, but Alex found it difficult to handle confinement yet again. Whether it was prison walls or the strict rules of rehab, he always found a way to run. On April 14th, Alex was found unresponsive in Missoula, Montana, after a drug overdose. Doctors at Providence St. Patrick Hospital fought to save him, but the damage had been done. It wasn't his first overdose in recent weeks. In fact, the doctor treating him recognized him immediately. Alex had already been in the hospital several times before. This time around, however, he wasn't so lucky. His heart had stopped. Medical staff worked desperately to revive him, but after days on life support, Alex King was declared legally dead on April 23, 2024. His family gathered for a final goodbye, though not in person. His last moments were witnessed through a screen, a heartbreaking farewell from miles away. He had once been the boy at the center of a case that captivated the nation, the child who made a confession that changed everything. But in the end, Alex King was just another lost soul, caught in the tight grip of a past that never let him go. And Ricky Chavez? He remains incarcerated, serving a 35-year sentence not for murder, but for false imprisonment and being an accessory to the crime. The murder of Terry King also ignited a media firestorm. Were the boys victims of abuse or cold-blooded killers? A book, a perversion of justice, a sudden tragedy of murder, lies and innocence betrayed, argued that they were innocent. But Assistant State Attorney David Rimmer had his own take. There will always be people who believe Derek and Alex are innocent. Just like there will always be people who believe that Michael Jackson is innocent. The murder of Terry King was not just a local tragedy, it became a nationwide sensation, dividing public opinion and sparking heated debates about justice, abuse, and manipulation. In conclusion, one of the most controversial takes on the case came from authors Catherine Medico and Molly Barrows in their book A Perversion of Justice, a Southern Tragedy of Murder, Lies and Innocence Betrayed. The book painted the King brothers not as cold-blooded killers, but as victims, children caught in a web of manipulation and discrepancies in the legal system. It suggested that the justice system failed them, raising a question that left goosebumps. Were the boys innocent all along? Years after their release, Derek and Alex King sat down for an exclusive Dateline NBC interview in a special titled Second Chances. For the first time in years, the brothers reunited on camera, their faces now marked by time and the weight of their past. They reflected on the choices that led them to that fateful night and the scars they carried from it. The case was also the subject of Evil Kin Season 1, Episode 5, titled Deadly Darlings. The episode delved deep into the chilling bond between the King brothers and the sinister influence of Ricky Chavez. The legal battle that followed was examined in American Justice Season 12, Episode 21, Blood Brothers, the Derek and Alex King case. It presented the twists and turns of the trial, leaving audiences to decide, were these boys monsters or merely pawns in a much larger, darker game? Even decades later, the story of Terry King's murder remains as unsettling as ever. Some still believe justice was served, while others insist that the full truth has yet to be uncovered. What do you think should have happened? I've never hurt my wife. I've never hurt her. This man would go on to do things so horrific, most people can't even begin to imagine. But here's what he won't tell you. Josh Powell wasn't just a bitter husband. He was a monster. She has a very low self-esteem because of severe emotional abuse as a child, and I've had to try to help her get through that. What happened to Susan Powell is still a mystery to this day. Story 4 In December 2009, she vanished without a trace from her home in West Valley City, Utah. No calls, no messages, just gone. And the only person who had an explanation was her husband, Josh Powell. His story starts long before Susan ever met him, and from the very beginning there were warning signs. Josh was born on January 20th, 1976, in Puyallup, Washington, to Stephen and Tereka Powell. He had 4 siblings, Michael, John, Jennifer, and Alina. But life in the Powell household was anything but normal. His father, Stephen, was controlling and inappropriate, creating a toxic environment for his children. According to divorce records, Stephen openly shared explicit content with his sons and refused to set boundaries. Josh grew up in a home where nothing fell off limits. Even adult content would play in front of the kids, and it showed in his behavior. As a teenager, he once killed his sister's pet gerbils out of anger. Another time, he held a knife to his mother's throat during an argument. And when things didn't go his way, he threatened to kill himself. In the year 2000, Josh met Susan Cox at a church dinner. She was kind, hardworking, and full of life. Within a year, they were married. But Susan had no idea what she was walking into. For a while, they lived with Josh's father, Stephen, in Washington. And that's when things got deeply disturbing. Stephen became obsessed with Susan. He followed her around with a camcorder, used a small mirror to spy on her while she used the bathroom, stole underwear from her laundry, read her journals, and posted love songs online under a pseudonym. One day, he finally confessed his feelings to Susan. The entire conversation, including the rejection in Susan's horrified voice, was accidentally recorded on his own camcorder. That was the final straw. Josh and Susan packed up and moved to Utah, hoping to put Stephen behind them. For a while, things seemed to settle down. Josh and Susan had 2 sons, Charlie and Braden. They moved to West Valley City, Utah, hoping for a fresh start, But behind the scenes, Susan's life was becoming more and more suffocating. Susan's friends could see how miserable she was. She told them Josh barely showed her any affection. It was like he was keeping her at arm's length, shutting her out completely. By the summer of 2008, things had hit rock bottom. Josh and Susan were constantly arguing, sometimes in front of their kids. He had become more controlling than ever, making all the decisions and leaving Susan feeling trapped. Their marriage wasn't just struggling, it was crumbling. Josh took complete control of their finances, forcing Susan to rely on him for even the smallest expenses. He cut back on grocery money, refused to buy her new clothes, and even made her account for every dollar she spent. While Josh kept their bank accounts under lock and key, he had no problem spending on himself. He wasted thousands while Susan struggled to afford basic necessities. Then there was the car. They had 2 vehicles, but Josh insisted that the family car was his to use. Instead of letting Susan drive to work, he forced her to ride a bike, no matter the weather, no matter how exhausted she was. He also began pulling away from their shared faith. The couple had been active members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But as time went on, Josh refused to go with Susan and the boys. He mocked her for believing, made excuses to skip services, and discouraged her from participating. But the worst betrayal was that he refused to cut ties with his father. Even though Susan had made it clear that Stephen was dangerous, disgusting, and not someone she wanted near their family. But Josh didn't care. He continued talking to his father, ignoring Susan's fears, and even let their young sons have contact with him. By 2007, Josh had racked up over $200,000 in debt. The financial stress added to their marital problems, and Susan knew things were spiraling. So she started documenting everything. In 2008, she recorded a video showing damage in their home that she blamed on Josh. That same year, she wrote a secret where she chillingly stated, "If I die, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one." And just a year later, she would vanish without a trace. Then her oldest kid would refuse to talk about her. "Charlie, has anybody talked to you about your mom?" "No, she got lost somewhere." "Tell me about your mom getting lost." "You didn't see where she got lost." "Where was the last place you did see her?" "John knows." "John does?" "Yeah, because he's one of the uncles that lives with my family." "He lives with your family? And he knows what?" "He went where Susan went." "He did? And where?" "Do you know where Susan went?" "No, John does." "We can't talk about Susan or camping." I always keep things a secret." On Sunday, December 6th, 2009, everything seemed normal, at least on the surface. That morning, Susan, Charlie, and Braden attended church as they always did. Susan was her usual self, chatting with friends and tending to her boys. Nothing seemed off. After church, a neighbor dropped by for a visit, spending some time with the family before leaving. No one could have guessed that this would be the last time anyone would ever see Susan again. The next morning, December 7th, everything immediately felt wrong. Susan didn't show up to work. She hadn't called in sick, hadn't mentioned taking the day off. Nothing. Meanwhile, the boys' nanny noticed that Josh never dropped them off, which was completely out of character. Concerned, she tried reaching the family, but no one picked up. As the hours passed with no word from either Susan or Josh, worry turned into fear. Josh's mother, Tarika, and his estranged sister, Jennifer Graves, heard about the situation and rushed to the house. When they arrived, they found the doors locked, the curtains drawn, and no sign of anyone inside. The eerie silence only made things worse. They knocked. They called. Nothing. Now in full panic mode, they contacted the police. Officers arrived and broke into the home, fearing the family might have suffered from carbon monoxide poisoning or some other emergency. What they found inside was unsettling. The house was empty, but something was off. Susan's purse, wallet, and identification were still there sitting untouched. Her cell phone was later found inside the family's only vehicle, a Chrysler Town and Country minivan that Josh had been using. It had been turned off. There was no sign of struggle, but something caught the officers' attention immediately. 2 box fans were positioned in the living room, blowing air directly at a damp patch on the couch. It was an odd detail, one that didn't sit right. Hours later, around 5 p.m., Josh finally returned home with Charlie and Braden. Police wasted no time in bringing him in for questioning. His explanation was bizarre. He claimed that after midnight, in the early hours of December 7th, he had taken his 2 young sons, ages 4 and 2, on a last-minute camping trip. The destination was oddly the Pony Express Trail in western Utah, a remote area with nothing but snow and freezing temperatures. He said Susan had stayed behind, sleeping at home. His story made no sense. Who takes their toddlers on an impromptu camping trip in below freezing temperatures in the middle of the night, especially when there's work and daycare in just a few hours? Police found it even more suspicious when they realized that Josh had never told his boss he wouldn't be coming into work that day. When asked why, he gave an even stranger response. He claimed he had simply lost track of the days and thought it was Sunday, not Monday. Investigators were determined to verify Josh's story. They sent a team to the exact area he claimed to have camped. There was no evidence that anyone had been there. No tire tracks in the snow. No footprints. No fire pit. Nothing. It was as if the trip had never happened. Then something even stranger happened. On December 8th, after a second round of police questioning, Josh suddenly rented a car from Salt Lake City International Airport, and then he disappeared for nearly 18 hours. His whereabouts during that time remain a mystery. When Josh finally resurfaced, he called his mother from Interstate 84 in Tremontian, Utah. He was disoriented, giving vague answers about where he had been. Later, he told his sister Jennifer that he had been aimlessly driving around the city, getting on and off different freeways at random. When police got hold of the rental car, they discovered that he had put an additional 807 miles on the odometer. Where did he go? What was he doing? To this day, no one knows. But one thing was becoming painfully clear. Josh Powell was hiding something. 2 days after Susan's disappearance, police searched the Powell home again. This time, they uncovered something unsettling. On the floor, they found traces of Susan's blood. Not a lot, but enough to raise serious questions. And then inside the house, they came across something even more unsettling. Life insurance policies on Susan totaling $1.5 million and a handwritten letter from Susan herself. In it, she detailed her growing fear for her life. She had been terrified of Josh, and now she was missing. Years later, DNA tests confirmed that one of the blood samples belonged to Susan. But another sample came from someone else, an unknown male contributor. To this day, his identity remains a mystery. As police dug deeper into Josh's actions after Susan's disappearance, his behavior became even more suspicious. He drained her retirement accounts, canceled her regular chiropractic appointments, and pulled his sons out of daycare, all within days of her going missing. It was as if he was erasing her from their lives. And then there was something even more disturbing. Josh had talked to co-workers before about how to dispose of a body in an abandoned mine shaft. At the time, people brushed it off as an odd, offhand comment. Now, it didn't seem so random. While investigators tried to piece together what had happened to Susan, they turned to the only other people who were with Josh that night were his sons. 4-year-old Charlie was questioned, and to everyone's surprise, he confirmed the camping trip had happened. But there was one major difference in his version of events. He said his mother had gone with them. According to him, Susan had been in the car that night, but she never came back. Weeks later, a teacher noticed Charlie making an alarming statement. He said his mother was dead. No details, no explanation, just a flat statement, as if it were something he had accepted. Then, Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, shared another disturbing discovery. At daycare, Charlie's younger brother, Braden, had drawn a picture of a van. When asked about it, he pointed at the back of the car and said, "Mommy was in the trunk." At this point, police were growing increasingly convinced that Josh knew exactly what had happened to Susan. They planned to bring him in for further questioning and subpoenaed all footage, both aired and unaired, of Josh's interviews with local news stations. But Josh had no interest in cooperating. On December 14th, he lawyered up. Over the next few days, he became more distant and unresponsive with authorities. Then, just before Christmas, he packed up his sons and left Utah, heading back to Puyallup, Washington, to stay with his father, Stephen Powell. By December 24th, police officially labeled him a person of interest. But the horrors were not over. Not yet. In 2010, Josh Powell moved into his father's home in Puyallup, Washington, bringing his 2 young sons, Charlie and Braden, with him. With Susan gone, it seemed like the Powell men were closing ranks. Josh made it clear he wasn't coming back to Utah, announcing plans to rent out their home in West Valley City. Some reports suggested that he left after losing his job, but to those who knew him, it felt like he was running from something. Not long after settling in Washington, a website called susanpowell.org popped up. It claimed to be the official website of Susan Powell, but instead of focusing on finding her, it was dedicated to defending Josh. The The posts accused Susan's family, her estranged sister-in-law, Jennifer Graves, and even the LDS Church of launching a smear campaign against Josh. Some of the posts went even further, suggesting Susan had run off to Brazil with another missing person, journalist Stephen Kuchar, a bizarre and completely baseless theory. It didn't take long for people to connect the dots. Josh and his father, Stephen Powell, were almost certainly the ones behind the site. Then, by late 2010, the Powells made an even more shocking claim. Susan had been mentally ill and had abandoned her family. It was a last-ditch effort to rewrite the narrative, but Susan's parents immediately shut it down. There was absolutely no evidence that Susan had left voluntarily, let alone that she was unstable. While Josh was doing everything he could to paint himself as the victim, police turned their attention to his father, Stephen Powell. A family friend had come forward, revealing that Stephen had been obsessed with Susan for years. When investigators seized Stephen's computers, they found 4,500 images of Susan, many of them taken without her knowledge. These weren't just regular pictures. They were disturbingly invasive close-ups of her body. At the same time, police started looking into Josh's brother, Michael Powell, after he did something suspicious. Shortly after Susan vanished, Michael had gotten rid of his broken-down Ford Taurus, selling it to a wrecking yard in Oregon. If that wasn't strange enough, he later ordered satellite images of the lot, as if he wanted to keep tabs on the car. When investigators tracked it down, they brought in cadaver dogs, and sure enough, the dogs indicated human remains had once been in the trunk. Unfortunately, DNA tests were inconclusive, leaving yet another unanswered question in the case. In September 2011, police thought they had finally found a break. While searching Topaz Mountain in Utah, an area Josh had visited often, they discovered what appeared to be a grave site. The ground had been recently disturbed and showed signs of shoveling. For days, investigators sifted through the soil, but in the end, they found no remains. To this day, it's unknown what, if anything, was buried there. Meanwhile, tensions between the Powell and Cox families were reaching a boiling point. After police raided Stephen Powell's home, both he and Josh went to the media, trying to spin the story in their favor. Stephen claimed that he and Susan had been falling in love before she disappeared, using old journal entries from when she was a teenager as proof that she had always been unstable. A judge wasn't buying it. Stephen and Josh were legally banned from publishing any of Susan's personal writings, and they were ordered to return or destroy any journals they had already released. Then everything blew up. On September 22nd, police arrested Stephen Powell on voyeurism and child pornography charges. Inside his home, investigators found Stephen's secretly recorded videos of young girls, adult women, and most disturbingly, Susan herself. It was clear Stephen's was dangerous, but the authorities believed Josh might not be innocent either. Washington's Assistant Attorney General John Long announced that Josh was now a subject in the investigation. The day after Stephen's arrest, Chuck Cox filed for custody of Charlie and Braden. At first, the court only granted him temporary custody, ruling that Josh could get them back if he moved out of Stephen's home. Josh rented a house in South Hill, Washington, making it look like he was complying, but authorities later alleged that he never actually moved in. By this point, Josh's own sister, Jennifer Graves, publicly stated that she believed he was responsible for Susan's disappearance. With the custody battle intensifying, Josh was court-ordered to undergo psychological evaluations. A forensic psychologist, James Manley, examined him and found a troubling pattern. Josh refused to acknowledge any normal human weaknesses or faults, and he exhibited highly controlling behavior with his sons. He was also deeply paranoid, constantly blaming the police and media for his problems. Despite these findings, there was no direct evidence of abuse, so Manley allowed Josh supervised visits with the boys. Then, in January 2012, everything changed. While reviewing computers seized from Josh's home, police found about 400 disturbing images of simulated child pornography, bestiality, and incest. The images had been cached from a previous owner, but Josh had viewed them. Though they weren't illegal, the psychologist handling his case was deeply concerned. Josh was ordered to undergo a full psychosexual evaluation and a polygraph test. With the walls closing in, Josh Powell was getting desperate, and soon, he would commit one of the most horrific acts imaginable. On February 5, 2012, social worker Elizabeth Griffin Hall pulled up to Josh Powell's house in South Hill, Washington, for what was supposed to be a routine supervised visit between him and his two little boys, Charlie and Braden. The court had ordered these visits to be monitored for the children's safety, so Hall was there to make sure everything went smoothly. But the moment she arrived, something fell off. As soon as the boys got to the front door, Josh yanked them inside and slammed it shut right in Hall's face. She barely had time to react before she heard the deadbolt click. She pounded on the door, shouting for him to open it, but he didn't answer. Panicked, she pulled out her phone and called 911. Her voice shook as she told the dispatcher what had just happened, that she was supposed to be supervising the visit, that Josh had locked her out, and that she feared for the boys. She begged them to send help fast, and then a deafening explosion ripped through the house, the force of it knocking Hall back. Within seconds, flames erupted, swallowing the home in thick black smoke. The heat was intense, searing the air around her as she stood frozen in horror. Neighbors came running, some screaming, some already on the phone with emergency services. But it was too late. The fire spread too fast. There was no way anyone inside could make it out alive. Investigators later confirmed what they had suspected all along. Josh had planned this. It wasn't some accident, not some tragic gas leak. He had soaked the house in gasoline, lighting it up like a death trap. The official cause of death for Charlie and Braden was carbon monoxide poisoning. But the truth was even more gruesome. Josh had attacked them with a hatchet before the fire even started. The day before, he had emptied his bank account, donated the boys' toys to charity, and sent out final emails to family and friends, cold, emotionless goodbyes. Charlie and Braden were buried next to the mother they never got to see again. But their family's fight was far from over. A year after Josh Powell took the lives of his two young sons and himself, his brother Michael followed a similarly tragic path. On February 11, 2013, Michael jumped from the roof of a parking garage in Minneapolis, ending his own life. His suicide raised even more suspicion. In 2012, police had repeatedly questioned him about his abandoned Ford Taurus, which had been discovered at an Oregon wrecking yard. When asked why he left it there, he had been evasive, refusing to give clear answers. Investigators later revealed that they believed both Josh and Michael had been involved in Susan's murder. Despite years of searching, Susan's case remained open, but with little hope of resolution. By May 21, 2013, West Valley City Police officially closed the active investigation into her disappearance. That same year, James Manley, the psychologist who had evaluated Josh for the state of Washington, admitted he had always suspected Josh had something to do with Susan's disappearance. However, those suspicions had never made it into his official report. His job was simply to assess Josh's parenting, not to investigate a crime. The battle over Susan's estate stretched on for years. In March 2015, Susan's father, Chuck Cox, finally won a lengthy legal fight against Tarika and Alina Powell, who had tried to have Susan declared legally dead so they could collect life insurance. Cox, however, gained full control of the estate, and then a surprising revelation emerged. In 2019, Salt Lake City radio station KSL, which had produced a deep-dive podcast on Susan's case called Cold, reported that the disturbing pornography discovered by West Valley City Police, the images that had played a role in Josh losing custody of his sons, hadn't even belonged to him. In fact, they weren't even found on his computer. The images had been on a second-hand computer that Susan had purchased from fellow members of her LDS church congregation. The previous owners had been the ones to view the material. But by the time this information came out, it was too late to change anything. The damage had already been done. There was still one last desperate effort to find Susan's remains. In early 2022, a crew led by Diesel Brothers TV personality Dave Sparks took on the challenge of searching a remote mine shaft in the Utah desert, hoping to finally bring Susan home. They uncovered rib bones, what appeared to be human vertebrae, scraps of clothing that was evidence that someone had died there. The remains were sent to a lab for DNA testing. But once again, it was another dead end. The bones weren't Susan's. They weren't even human. A pair of pants found with the bones tested positive for male DNA, leaving yet another mystery. Who did they belong to? And more importantly, will Susan Powell ever be found? We're done. So is he asking you to, kill him? I just don't understand. Yeah, that's what I've been doing for a while. And I can't get him to stop breathing. He's gonna be 18 tomorrow, but he didn't want to turn 18. This boy never got the chance to turn 18 because his own mother made sure of that. Just hours before he was supposed to step into adulthood, she picked up the phone and called 911. But instead of crying for help, she delivered a chilling statement, and that is she couldn't get him to stop breathing. Story 5. Most mothers would fight tooth and nail to keep their child alive, but this one, she did the exact opposite. And it makes you wonder, what kind of mother does something so unthinkable? And how did it come to this? To even try to understand how this all happened, we have to go back to where it started, to a quiet little apartment complex that, by all accounts, should have been just another ordinary place to live. Bay Point Apartments, sitting at 791 East 16th Street in Holland, Michigan. A place meant to be a home, a safe haven, a spot where people came back after a long day, kicked off their shoes, and settled into the comfort of their lives. The Bay Point Apartments community wasn't just some rundown complex. It featured 1- and 2-bedroom units, along with 2-bedroom lofts. Residents had access to central heating and air conditioning, washer and dryer hookups in select apartments, and even a large swimming pool to cool off in the summer. It was a pet-friendly place, too. Cats and dogs were welcome, adding to the sense of home for those who lived there. On the surface, it was just another suburban apartment complex, the kind of place where people went about their business without too much drama. And among those residents were Katie Lee and her son, Austin Pickhart. Just a small family trying to make it through life like everyone else. From the outside, they seemed normal enough. Austin was a quiet, intelligent teenager with a deep love for books, science, and video games. He wasn't the kind of kid who got into trouble. If anything, he was the opposite, smart, reserved, a bit of a dreamer. And Katie? She was a single mother who had spent years raising him on her own. Life wasn't easy, but they had each other. Neighbors didn't see anything too out of the ordinary. They weren't a loud, troublesome family. They kept to themselves, blended into the background of their small Michigan town. If you passed them on the street, you probably wouldn't have thought twice. But behind closed doors where no neighbors could see, where no friendly hellos could catch the truth, something was brewing, something dark, something no one saw coming. For years, Austin and his mom had an unusually close relationship. Some might even say it was too close. Friends recall that Katie was overprotective, treating Austin like a child even as he inched closer to adulthood. She had a hard time letting go, clinging to him like he was all she had in the world. And in a way he was. Austin's father wasn't in the picture much, and Katie had no other children. It was just the two of them against the world. Until apparently it wasn't. At first, Austin didn't seem to mind his mother's tight grip on his life. But as he got older, things changed. He wanted freedom, independence. He wanted to make his own choices. He was on the verge of turning 18, officially an adult, free to do whatever he pleased. Maybe he'd go off to college. Maybe he'd get a job and move out. Maybe he'd start a life of his own, one that didn't revolve around his mother. And that, it seems, is where things took a deadly turn. Sometime in the early hours of February 21st, 2025, just one day before Austin's 18th birthday, Katie Lee picked up the phone and dialed 911. But instead of the usual panic or desperation you'd expect in an emergency call, her words were cold, eerie, almost robotic. She told the dispatcher she couldn't get her son to stop breathing. "Hi, I need an officer here immediately." "Okay, to where?" "To the apartment she shared with her son, Austin Pickhart. My son won't stop breathing." "He won't stop what?" "Breathing." "He won't stop breathing?" "Right." Let that sink in for a second. Not that he wasn't breathing. Not that he was in distress. But that she couldn't get him to stop. When police arrived at the Bay Point apartment complex, they found a scene straight out of a nightmare. Austin was dead. His throat had been slashed, and he had multiple stab wounds on his arms, wounds that, according to experts, looked suspiciously like defensive wounds, as if he had fought back, as if he hadn't wanted to die. Katie, standing at the doorway with a knife still in her hands, didn't resist arrest, but she didn't surrender easily either. She allegedly made a threatening move toward the officers, forcing them to deploy a taser before taking her into custody. Once she was down, she reportedly told investigators she had hoped the police would kill her so she could be with her son. Then the details got even darker. According to police reports, Katie and Austin had attempted to take their own lives together by overdosing on medication the previous day. But when Austin passed out and the overdose failed, Katie took matters into her own hands, literally. She grabbed a knife and slashed his throat while he lay unconscious, a brutal, irreversible act. The most baffling part of this case isn't just that a mother murdered her son, it's why she claims she did it. According to Katie, Austin didn't want to turn 18. He was afraid of adulthood, of growing up. He couldn't handle the idea of becoming an adult. But let's be real here. How many teenagers actually feel this way? Sure, some fear the responsibilities that come with adulthood. But let's not pretend turning 18 is some kind of death sentence. For most kids, that milestone is something to celebrate. It means freedom. It means being able to buy a lottery ticket, legally get a tattoo, vote, maybe even move out on their own. If Katie's claims were true, it would mean Austin had been suicidal. But was he? Had he actually begged his mother to help him stop breathing? Or was this just her twisted way of justifying the unthinkable? And even if he had been feeling suicidal, why wouldn't a mother seek help for her child instead of taking matters into her own hands? Why wouldn't she do everything in her power to prevent his death rather than cause it? The pieces just don't add up. For days later, Katie Lee appeared in court. Her face was stained with tears, and she could barely contain her sobs as she sat before the judge. Her shoulders shook uncontrollably, her body trembling as though the weight of everything had finally crashed down on her. For the entire 10-minute hearing, she wept, gasping between sobs, her emotions so raw that it almost seemed like she was just now realizing what she had done. But if she thought her tears would earn her sympathy, she was gravely mistaken. Judge Bradley Knoll was unmoved. His expression remained hard, unreadable, and his decision was swift and absolute, no bond. Katie wouldn't be walking free anytime soon. Perhaps it was the right call, considering her behavior when officers first arrived at the scene. She hadn't just cooperated meekly when they found her. No, she had allegedly threatened them, her grief and anger manifesting as violence, a knife still in her hands. She hadn't wanted to let go of it. She hadn't wanted to surrender. And now, here she was, her fate slipping further and further out of her control. Even in court, her defiance hadn't disappeared entirely. She resisted the public defender's office, refusing legal representation at first, as though she could take on this case alone. But reality wasn't something she could ignore. After several minutes of back and forth, of whispered conversations and quiet pleas from those trying to help her, she finally gave in. With a hollow nod, she agreed to let them assign her a public defender. It was the only choice she had left. But the real shock of the day wasn't Katie's sobs, nor was it the judge's unwavering stance. The most jaw-dropping moment didn't come from Katie at all. It came from her family. They were still there, standing by her, supporting her. Even after everything, they hadn't abandoned her. As the hearing came to a close, as the judge gave his final words and the proceedings were wrapped up, voices from the courtroom rose, breaking through the heavy silence, saying, "We love you, Katie." However, the legal battle ahead is grim. Katie Lee is facing an open murder charge, which means the jury will be the ones to decide what degree of murder she is guilty of. If they determine she acted with premeditation, if they believe she planned her son's death beforehand, then she will be convicted of first-degree murder, a charge that could lead to life in prison. But if the jury finds that she acted in the heat of the moment without prior planning, then she will be convicted of second-degree murder. Either way, the result is the same. Austin is gone, and Katie Lee will pay the price. But her troubles don't end there. On top of the murder charge, she's also facing a charge of resisting and obstructing an officer. When police arrived at the scene, she allegedly waved a knife at them, her behavior erratic and aggressive. It was as if she had no intention of making things easy, not for herself, not for law enforcement, not for anyone. No official trial date has been set yet, but when it does happen, it won't just be another case for the books. This trial will be something people won't forget. It will be a long, painful process for everyone involved. Austin's friends who are still trying to make sense of his sudden and brutal death, his extended family who now have to live with a nightmare they never imagined, and even the outsiders, the true crime followers who consume these cases daily, but still find themselves shaken by this one. Because no matter how many stories we hear about parents killing their children, this one feels different. This one feels personal. And the biggest question remains why. Why did Katie Lee do this? What could possibly make a mother take her own child's life? The explanation she allegedly gave, that Austin didn't want to live past 17, is chilling. It's the kind of statement that makes you pause, that makes you wonder if you heard it correctly. There is no known history of suicidal thoughts. No evidence has surfaced that suggests he struggled with depression. No close friends or relatives have come forward to say that he had been unhappy. If anything, Austin's future seemed bright. He loved science. He loved space. He had dreams and aspirations, ideas of who he wanted to become. So why would he suddenly wish to throw all of that away? And then, there's the possibility of money. Follow the money. That's what investigators always say. Did she have a life insurance policy on Austin? Could there have been something to gain financially from his death? Nothing has been confirmed yet, but it's a question worth asking. People have killed for far less. If Katie stood to benefit financially, then suddenly, this case takes on an even darker edge. Or was the answer something even more terrifying? Was mental illness at play? Did she suffer from delusions? Did she believe she was saving Austin? There have been cases before where people, often suffering from severe psychological disorders, convince themselves that killing their loved ones is an act of mercy. Did Katie truly believe Austin was better off dead? Did she think she was doing him a favor? And what about drugs? Could she have been under the influence? Drug use can explain erratic behavior, paranoia, aggression. But here's the most horrifying part. No toxicology reports have been mentioned, which means that, as of now, there is no evidence that Katie was high when she did this. And that makes it so much worse. Because if she wasn't in some drug-induced haze, if she wasn't under the influence of anything, then that means she did it completely sober. It means she made this choice with a clear mind. Perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of this entire case is the reaction from Katie's family. How does one rationalize standing by a family member after something like this? How do you look at a woman who has done something so unspeakable and still say we love you? Is it denial? A refusal to accept reality? Or is it something deeper? A kind of unconditional love that defies logic? Some families cut ties immediately, unable to stomach the betrayal. Others cling to the past, unable to let go of the person they once knew. But at some point, reality has to set in. At some point, they will have to ask themselves if Katie Lee could do this to Austin. Who's to say she wouldn't have done it to someone else? Who's to say she wouldn't do it again? At the heart of this case is a single devastating truth. Katie Lee failed her son in the worst way imaginable. A mother is supposed to protect her child, to keep them safe, to be their shield against the horrors of the world. Instead, Katie became the monster her son should have been protected from. And the worst part, we may never fully understand why. No matter how many hearings take place, no matter how many psychological evaluations are conducted, one voice will never be heard. Austin's. And that is the real tragedy. The remaining family is doing everything they can to keep Austin's memory alive. They even created a GoFundMe in his honor, hoping to give him the kind of send-off he deserves. The organizer, Elisa Paycart, didn't go into details about what really happened, but one thing is clear. They want the world to remember Austin for the bright, loving person he was, not the way his life ended. She described him as caring, funny, and full of life. He loved his family and friends more than anything, but if there was one thing that truly fascinated him, it was space, galaxies, planets, the unknown. He loved it all. And now, his family has come up with a plan that feels almost poetic. Instead of a traditional burial, they want to send his ashes into space on an actual rocket ship. It's the kind of farewell that matches his dreams, making sure that even in death he reaches for the stars. Of course, losing someone like this isn't just emotionally devastating, it comes with financial struggles too. Funerals, memorials, and everything in between add up fast. Elisa said that some people have already reached out, asking how they can help, and honestly the best way right now is through donations. Every little bit helps as they work toward their goal of celebrating Austin's life the way he would have wanted. So far, the GoFundMe has raised over $6,000, but they're hoping to reach $12,000. It's not just about money. It's about giving Austin a proper goodbye, one that honors the person he was. Meanwhile, Katie Lee is sitting in jail, facing some of the most serious charges imaginable. Open murder, resisting an officer, no bond. She's not going anywhere anytime soon, and if she's convicted, Michigan law could put her away for life. But here's the big question. Did she really do this because Austin wanted her to? Or is there something much darker at play? What do you think? Drop your thoughts below, and if there's another case you want us to cover, let us know. Killing a whole family is already evil enough, but to torture, molest, and trap a child in a barrel for 2 whole days before eventually killing her is a whole new different kind of evil. This wasn't just a murder, it was a nightmare that crawled into reality. And out of all the cases we've uncovered, this one stands out as one of the most disturbing. So brutal, so twisted, that even hardened police officers couldn't erase it from their minds. Because for Felicia Elliott and the entire Elliott family, this wasn't just a crime story. Story 6 was their living, breathing hell back in the late 1990s. And it would take years before justice finally broke through the shadows. And what happened on that night? It will enrage you, haunt you, and make you wish you could reach through time just to land a punch on the monsters behind it. But before we dive into the terrifying details, let's take a moment to know who the Elliot family really was. For starters, not much is known about the early years of the Elliot family. But what we do know paints a picture of an ordinary family living a simple, yet fulfilling life. Carl Elliot married Lisa Elliot several years before the events that would tragically change their lives forever. Their love story was followed by the birth of their first child, a daughter named Felicia, and then just a year later, their son Gregory came into the world. Carl worked tirelessly, holding down 2 jobs as both a mechanic and a carpenter, doing everything he could to provide for his growing family. The Elliots lived in a cozy house situated on a decent-sized property in the small, rural town of Dalton, Arkansas. Now Dalton was a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else, and life moved at a slower, more peaceful pace. Behind their house, the Elliots had a mobile home set up for Lisa's elderly parents, who were facing serious health issues. Her father and stepmother both struggled with mental health problems, possibly dementia, and were slowly losing their hearing. So it was important for Lisa to have them nearby. They were family, after all, and Carl and Lisa wanted to care for them in their later years. The town itself was quiet, almost forgotten by time, but it wasn't without its darker sides. While it may have seemed like a safe haven, the lack of law enforcement presence made Dalton a prime location for the drug trade. But for the Elliots, life remained untouched by such troubles until the night of July 30th, 1998. That night, a fierce storm swept across the town, the rain falling in torrents, pounding the earth, and turning the streets into rivers. Around 1:15 in the morning, Deputy Randy Barber, who was on patrol that night, received a call about a domestic disturbance at the Elliot home on Township Road. When he arrived at the property, he could hear shouting from inside, but by the time he got to the door, everything was strangely quiet. The rain still pounded relentlessly, but there were no lights on, no signs of trouble. With no immediate reason for concern, the deputy decided not to perform a welfare check and left, thinking everything was fine. What he didn't know, though, was that the nightmare had already begun. As morning arrived and the storm slowly passed, Lisa's stepmother, Mrs. Dubois, woke up and went to open her front door. To her surprise, the door wouldn't budge. Something heavy was blocking it. She tried pushing against it, but it didn't move. Frustrated, she gave up and went around to the other side of the house. But when she reached the porch, she found there would forever change her life. Lying in front of the door was the lifeless body of her 27-year-old stepdaughter, Lisa Elliot. Panicked, Mrs. Dubois rushed back inside to alert her husband, Kenny. Sheriff Rob Sammons soon arrived at the scene. When he knocked on the front door, he found it slightly ajar. Calling out to see if anyone was home, he was met with silence, only the faint hum of a television playing in the distance. The stillness was unsettling, and a sinking feeling began to set in. What had happened inside that home was far worse than anyone could have imagined, and what followed would leave the entire town of Dalton in shock for years to come. The moment the officer stepped into the house, the horror was immediate. Lying lifeless on the living room floor was young Gregory Elliot, just 6 years old. His small frame, still in pajamas, painted a heartbreaking picture of innocence lost far too soon. Sheriff Rob Sammons, shaken but determined, swept through the rest of the house in search of survivors. But what he found instead were haunting traces of a struggle. Blood smeared across the kitchen, splattered in the dining area, and even staining a child's toy telephone left behind on a desk. It was clear someone had fought with everything they had. Outside, Lisa Elliot, just 27, was still in the same spot where her stepmother had discovered her hours earlier, collapsed on the front porch. Investigators noticed a bloody handprint smeared on her father's door, suggesting she had tried to escape, maybe even call for help. But there was no time, and something was still terribly wrong. 2 family members were missing, 30-year-old Carl Elliot and his daughter Felicia, only 7. In cases like this, the spouse is naturally the first suspect, especially since he was missing alongside his daughter. But just 48 hours later, that theory was shattered. Carl's lifeless body was pulled from the nearby 11-Point River. He had been executed, shot twice in the back of the head with a .22 caliber weapon, and shallow knife wounds were visible across his throat. He had been silenced. The autopsies that followed were gruesome and deeply unsettling. Lisa had endured 27 blows to the head, each strike believed to come from a tire iron found at the crime scene. But what ended her life was even more vicious. The killer took the iron and drove it deep into her throat, cutting through her carotid artery and severing her windpipe. Gregory, her little boy, had suffered just as much. The The same weapon had been used to stab into his throat repeatedly. His skull had been fractured by a blow, his jaw was broken, and knife wounds covered his tiny body. After Carl Elliott's body was discovered, one terrifying question remained. Where was little Felicia? The thought of a 7-year-old girl out there, lost, taken, or worse, haunted not only the family's loved ones but the entire community. Investigators searched for answers for 2 long years. Every lead ended in frustration. Every hope slowly faded. And with each passing day, the possibility of finding Felicia alive grew dimmer. Then on a quiet afternoon, September 7th, 2000, everything changed. A hunter was out near Warm Springs, deep in the woods, just doing what he normally did. But what he stumbled upon that day was no ordinary discovery. Lying in a dry creek bed were what appeared to be human remains. The area had been untouched for some time, nature slowly reclaiming what was left behind. The hunter quickly contacted the authorities, and when investigators arrived, they collected everything they could from the scene. DNA testing later confirmed the heartbreaking truth. The remains belonged to Felicia Elliott. She had been found, but the relief was quickly swallowed by sorrow. Due to how much time had passed and how far the body had decomposed, the medical examiner could not determine exactly how she died. During the investigation, many names came up, but one family in particular kept drawing attention. The Greens were no strangers to trouble. Living in nearby Randolph County, the Green family had a dangerous reputation. Billy Green, the head of the family, was a well-known drug dealer in the area. His oldest son, Chad Green, worked right alongside him, and strangely enough, Chad and Carl Elliott had once been close. They had done a few drug deals together. By all accounts, they had a good relationship, until suddenly they didn't. Something had happened between them, something that changed everything. Rumors began to circulate. Some said that Carl Elliott had stolen several marijuana plants from the Greens, and that the family was furious. Others whispered that Lisa Elliott, just 2 months before the murders, had reached out to someone, desperately asking for a loan of $10,000. She said they owed money to the Greens, and that she was terrified of what they might do. The Greens had a long history of violence and criminal behavior, so it was no surprise that the investigators kept their eyes on them. Over the years, the police questioned them more than once, but they never had enough solid evidence to make an arrest. It was frustrating, like trying to hold water in your hands. But then, almost 5 years after the Elliott family was brutally torn apart, fate stepped in. On July 29, 2003, a single piece of information came to light, and it changed everything. A confidential informant, later identified as Mary Green, Billy Green's former wife, shocked investigators with a crucial revelation that would begin to unravel the truth. Shared exactly what her son, Chad Green, had told her about the night of the murders. She also revealed things that Billy himself had confessed to her. According to Mary, on the evening of July 29, 1998, Billy received a phone call from Chad and left their home without saying a word. He was gone for hours, and Mary had no idea what was happening until 2 years later, when Billy finally admitted the truth. Billy told her that he had gone to meet Chad to help him clean up after the murders. Billy allegedly told Mary that Chad was responsible for all 4 deaths, the brutal murders of Carl, Lisa, Gregory, and Felicia Elliott. But Chad, in a twist, claimed multiple times that it was his father, Billy, who was the true culprit. This contradiction only deepened the mystery, but it also gave investigators a new lead. The breakthrough came when just the following day, police arrested 27-year-old Chad Green and his father, 47-year-old Billy Green, on unrelated charges. While they were in custody, investigators began applying pressure, using this new information they'd received from Mary. Billy, calm and collected, refused to be shaken, but Chad wasn't as strong. Eventually, Chad cracked under the pressure and started talking. He agreed to testify against his father in exchange for a plea deal. The deal would reduce his charges to a 40-year sentence for his role in the quadruple homicide, and Chad accepted the bargain, hoping for a lighter sentence. With a heavy heart, Chad began explaining what had happened that fateful night. He confirmed that Carl Elliott had been involved in illegal dealings with Billy and himself, and even admitted that Carl had stolen from Billy, a crime that enraged the elder Green. Billy was furious about the theft and wanted revenge. Together, father and son had come up with a plan. Chad described how, on the night of the murders, the Elliots were getting ready for bed when a knock sounded at their door. It was Chad, claiming his truck had broken down about a mile from their house and asking Carl for help. Carl, being a friend, agreed without hesitation. They both got into Carl's car and left the house. According to Chad, when they reached the location of the broken truck, Billy was already there waiting. Without warning, Billy shot Carl twice in the back of the head, killing him instantly, and then pushed his body into the nearby river. Afterward, Billy and Chad took Carl's car and drove back to the Elliott residence. As they returned, Billy made it clear that they had to clean up the loose ends. That's when things took a horrifying turn. As they pulled up to the Elliott home, young Gregory Elliott saw his father's car and rushed to the door. Who exactly Gregory encountered remains unclear, but according to Chad, it was Billy who greeted the boy at the door. Chad stayed outside by the car, but was soon startled by the sound of shouting and chaos inside. Concerned, he went in to check on his father. That's where he allegedly found Billy violently attacking Lisa Elliott. Billy, seeing Chad, quickly ordered him to go back outside, saying that the situation didn't concern him. As Chad continued his chilling recount, he recalled turning to leave the house only to see young Gregory Elliott lying lifeless on the floor. After Billy finished with Lisa Elliott, the mother, he went on to find the final member of the Elliott family, little Felicia. She had been hiding in her bedroom, terrified. Billy wrapped the small child in blankets and carried her outside. Chad could see that Felicia was still alive, moving slightly, but that wouldn't last for long. Billy, without any hesitation, placed the girl into the trunk of the car, taping her hands and mouth shut to ensure she couldn't escape or cry out. As they were about to drive away from the Elliott home, something caught Billy's eye. He looked out the window and saw movement across the yard. It was Lisa Elliott, still alive, crawling across the lawn. Billy didn't think twice. He got out of the car and, without mercy, ended her life. Once Lisa was no longer a threat, Billy returned to the car and the two men left the property, seemingly unfazed by the carnage they had left behind. However, the horror didn't end there. Chad later claimed that Felicia Elliott was kept alive for 2 more days, 2 agonizing days. She was locked in a trash can inside the garage, where the temperature soared well above 100 degrees. The poor little girl endured unspeakable horrors during those days. And Chad claimed that at one point Billy uttered a chilling phrase: "All good things must come to an end." It was then that Felicia's life would be tragically snuffed out. Billy, with no hint of remorse, drove her to a creek about half a mile from their home. There, he forced her head underwater, holding her down until she could no longer fight for her life. To finish the horrific act, he slashed her throat, ending her life on the night of August 1st, 1998. The investigation and legal proceedings would drag on for years, but justice seemed to finally be within reach. In the year 2004, both Billy and Chad Green were convicted of the murders. Billy was sentenced to the death penalty for his role in the brutal killings, while Chad, who had cooperated with authorities and provided critical information about the murders, received a plea deal and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. However, just when it seemed like the case had been resolved, an unexpected turn of events occurred. In the year 2006, the Arkansas Supreme Court made a shocking decision to overturn Billy's conviction. The reason? A significant legal error. A key witness for the prosecution had testified that she believed Billy was responsible for the death of her nephew and claimed she was terrified of him. But her testimony was based on an unrelated event entirely, and the court ruled that this should not have been allowed. This was seen as a serious breach of legal protocol, and as a result, Billy's conviction was thrown out. A new trial was ordered, throwing the case back into the public eye. In the second trial, which took place in May of 2012, Chad refused to testify against his father. This refusal to cooperate effectively voided his original plea deal, and he would need to be resentenced. One of the most pivotal moments came from a witness who had once been Billy's cellmate in the Arkansas Department of Corrections. This inmate, who was housed with Billy at the Federal Correctional Institute in Fort Worth in 2008, would provide crucial testimony that would ultimately shed more light on the chilling events leading up to the murders. On May 3rd, the inmate testified about what Billy had confided in him while they were in prison together. According to the inmate, Billy revealed that his son, Chad, had hurt Felicia on multiple occasions prior to the murders. The young girl, too afraid to stay silent, had allegedly told her father, Carl Elliott, about the abuse. Billy's response was chilling. He claimed that Felicia's father had been planning to take the information to the sheriff. Billy said this is why Chad had gone to the Elliott home in the first place, to stop Carl from going to the authorities. Billy explained that, in a fit of rage and desperation, Chad decided to lure Carl to the 11 Point River where he shot him. But the violence didn't stop there. Billy said that once Chad returned to the house, he killed the remaining members of the Elliott family, sparing no one. The inmate testified that Chad stabbed Lisa Elliott with a knife before taking Felicia. Billy also claimed that Felicia's final words were a heartbreaking plea. Quote, "Please don't hurt me." But the revelations didn't stop with the inmate's testimony. As the retrial unfolded, Billy Green, in a stunning twist, turned the tables and testified against his own son, Chad. During the trial, Billy recounted a conversation he had with Chad days after the slayings. The two were driving back to their home in Warm Springs from a convenience store when Billy asked Chad if he had killed the Elliott family. Chad, with tears streaming down his face, admitted to the murders. He explained that on the night of the killings, he had driven to the 11-Point River, but his truck broke down. After walking to Carl's house to ask for help, the situation quickly escalated. According to Billy's testimony, Chad said that an argument had broken out between him and Carl, and during the struggle, Chad had shoved a gun in Carl's face. The gun went off, and Carl was killed instantly. Afterward, Chad rolled Carl's body into the river and returned to the Elliott house to finish what he had started. He murdered Lisa and Gregory Elliott before taking Felicia, wrapping her in a rug and placing her in the trunk of the car. But the horror didn't end there. Billy claimed that after they had driven away, Chad carried the little girl through a wooded area and into a creek that had flooded during a storm. In the darkness, he murdered Felicia as well. Billy explained that he hadn't originally disclosed his son's confession in 1998 because he feared Chad would be convicted and sentenced to death. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that there was no concrete evidence to pin the murders solely on one person. Investigators had no reliable witnesses, and the DNA evidence was inconclusive, making it impossible to charge just one of the Greens. In the end, Chad Green was sentenced to 4 life sentences in prison for the murders of Carl, Lisa, Gregory, and Felicia Elliott. On top of that, he received an additional 40 years for kidnapping Felicia. In an unrelated case, Chad was also convicted of assaulting 2 young girls and received another 56 years for those crimes. As it turned out, Chad Green had a deeply disturbing reputation within his community. He was known to have a history of being a pedo, making the theory that he had sexually assaulted Felicia prior to the murders all the more chilling. The possibility that Felicia had confided in her father, Carl, about the abuse, and that Carl had been planning to go to the sheriff, painted a dark and twisted picture of the motivations behind the murders. This explains why Chad decided to eliminate everyone. Billy Green, too, could not escape the consequences of his involvement in these horrific acts. He was sentenced to 4 life sentences for the murders of Carl, Lisa, Gregory, and Felicia Elliott. On top of that, he received an additional 40 years for his role in the kidnapping of Felicia. However, due to the circumstantial nature of the case, with no solid physical evidence directly linking him to the killings, the death penalty was taken off the table. The lack of irrefutable evidence meant that Billy would spend the rest of his life behind bars, but the justice system could not offer the finality that many hoped for. Today, both Billy and Chad Green are serving their life sentences at the Arkansas Department of Corrections, where they will remain for the rest of their lives. The tragic Elliott family was laid to rest together at the Gravesville Cemetery in Dalton, Arkansas, their lives forever cut short by the brutal actions of 2 men. As much as this case was full of confusion, twists, and finger-pointing, one thing is clear. Both Billy and Chad played significant roles in the horrifying deaths of the Elliott family. While the true extent of each person's responsibility may never be fully understood, the judge and jury made a decisive move by handing down identical sentences for both father and son, ensuring that justice was served in the only way it could be. But now, I want to know what you think. Do you believe the right people were convicted, or do you think there's more to the story that hasn't come to light? Was the sentencing too harsh, or just right? Do you think we'll ever truly know the whole truth about what went down that night? I'm dying to hear your opinions on this, so let's get the conversation going in the comments below. The Bluestone family had it all. A respected father who served as a police officer, a radiant mother named Jill, and 4 beautiful children. Tucked away in a quiet neighborhood in Gravesend, Kent, they seemed like the kind of family everyone admired. But if there's one thing we've learned from true crime, it's that what you see on the outside can be a complete lie. Because hidden behind the walls of that tidy home was a terrifying truth. One that would only come to light when 7-year-old Jessica Bluestone ran to a neighbor screaming that her father was trying to hurt her. And trust me, this is the kind of case that will stick with you for days, gnawing at you, leaving you with one chilling thought. Story 7. What kind of father could do something like this to his own family? To truly understand how things spiraled so dark, let's first dive into the life of the man at the center of it all, the patriarch Carl Bluestone. Carl was 36 at the time of the tragic events, and let me tell you, he wasn't some rookie cop. He was an experienced, seasoned police officer with the Rural Support Tactical Team of the Kent Police Force in England. Born and raised in a small coastal town, Carl had what you could call a peaceful, yet challenging childhood. His dad worked as a mechanic, and his mom was a primary school teacher. From a young age, Carl was known for his strong character and his sense of responsibility. He wasn't just a bystander in his community. He was involved, regularly volunteering for causes like supporting orphanages and taking part in local environmental cleanup campaigns. The kid was all about action. As a young man, Carl became obsessed with stories of justice and bravery. Those heroic police officers you see in movies and read about in books. So it was no surprise when he decided to pursue a career in public policing. After completing his undergraduate degree in criminology in London, Carl joined the Kent Police Force, eager to make his mark. Now it didn't take long for Carl to prove himself. He quickly became known as an outstanding officer, especially in patrolling and emergency response. For the first 10 years of his career, Carl worked in the hustle and bustle of busy urban areas. But eventually he realized there was a need for a strong police presence in rural areas too. So Carl transitioned to the rural support, where he specialized in complex cases, things like cattle rustling, poaching, and protecting rural areas from organized crime. As you can guess, Carl had a natural gift for connecting with the people in the communities he served. He earned their trust and cooperation, which made him a very effective officer. He showed great leadership and made smart decisions, especially in stressful situations. One of his biggest cases involved leading his team to take down a group involved in poaching rare animals, helping bring more than 10 people to justice. For Carl, being a police officer wasn't just a job, it was his way of standing up for what he believed in and protecting what mattered most to him. And of course, at some point, he must have thought, if I can protect an entire community, why not start building my own family? That thought slowly became a reality. In 1993, Carl's life took another significant turn when he met Jill at a social party in Kent. Jill, at 31, was a successful administrative officer at Basildon Council. With her intelligence, independence, and solid career, Jill was the kind of woman who naturally attracted attention. But it was Carl, with his calm demeanor and engaging conversational style, who really caught her eye. Carl, for his part, was immediately impressed by Jill's sharpness and strong sense of independence. She was the kind of woman who seemed to have everything together in life. It didn't take long before they started dating, and through their regular meetings, evening walks by the sea, and weekend trips, their bond deepened. By 1994, just a year after they met, they decided to tie the knot when Jill became pregnant with their first child. The wedding was simple, yet deeply meaningful. It was an intimate affair, with only close family and friends in attendance. The joy in the air was contagious as Carl and Jill exchanged vows. The smiles on everyone's faces a clear reflection of the hopeful future they were stepping into. After their wedding, Carl stayed with the Kent Police Force and slowly moved up the ranks. He was respected by his team and admired by many. Jill, just as hardworking, kept growing in her role as an administrative officer at Basildon Council. Together they worked hand in hand to build a life filled with love, stability, and success. They were the kind of couple people looked up to, strong in their careers, and deeply committed to their growing family. At first, life felt almost perfect. The couple welcomed 3 more children, and with each new addition, their bond seemed to grow stronger. Their home was full of laughter, milestones, and memories. From the outside looking in, they were a picture of happiness, a loving mom and dad, for beautiful children, and careers that kept getting better. Friends and neighbors would often say they were goals. But sometimes, what you see on the outside doesn't reflect what's really going on behind closed doors. As time passed, tiny cracks began to show in what seemed like a flawless life. These signs were small at first, hardly noticeable, but by the year 2000, things had started to change in a serious way. Carl, who had always been known for his calm and confident presence in uniform, was becoming someone very different at home. To his co-workers and friends, Carl still appeared kind and put together. But to Jill and the kids, he was becoming someone they barely recognized. At home, his patience began to wear thin. He started controlling things that didn't seem like a big deal, like where Jill went, who she talked to, and how she spent her time. What started as small comments slowly turned into strict rules, and those rules turned into threats. It didn't stop there. His voice, once calm and soft, was now full of anger. He began yelling during arguments, screaming so loud that it scared the children and left Jill shaking. Then came the violence. One night, while Jill was pregnant with their fourth child, they had an argument that got out of control. Carl exploded in anger and struck her, hard, hitting her shoulder and chest. She was left bruised, shocked, and afraid. That was the moment everything changed. From then on, the violence became part of their daily life. The man who had once protected communities was now the one they needed protection from. Carl's temper only grew worse. He would wave a knife in front of Jill, his hands trembling with rage, warning her not to test him. When things didn't go his way, he would throw objects, sometimes even in the direction of the children, just to scare them into silence. If Jill ever tried to leave the house during an argument, Carl would lock the doors, trapping her inside. The happy home they had built slowly turned into a place of fear. Jill, once full of confidence and joy, became quiet and cautious, always on edge. The children, too, learned to tiptoe around their father, hoping not to set him off. What once looked like a dream life from the outside had become a nightmare no one saw coming. By June of 2001, after years of walking on eggshells, Jill finally hit her breaking point. She had stayed strong for so long, but the pain, the fear, and the control had taken too much from her. It had drained her spirit. She reached deep inside herself, found the courage that had been buried, and made a choice, a powerful, life-changing choice. She told Carl she wanted a divorce, but instead of listening, instead of understanding that he had gone too far, Carl completely lost control. His ego, already bruised by years of clinging to power through violence, couldn't take the idea of losing her. His rage exploded. He attacked Jill again, but this time it was worse, much worse. He wrapped his hands around her neck and began to choke her. Jill couldn't even fight back. She passed out right there in their home. It could have ended her life. Thankfully, a neighbor heard the commotion and stepped in just in time. If it weren't for that brave soul, Jill might not have made it out alive. Now some people might ask, why didn't Jill report him sooner? Why didn't she press charges or just leave before things got so bad? And those are fair questions. When we look at situations like this from the outside, it can be hard to understand why someone would stay. But once you hear the full story, you'll see that it's never that simple. And after you do, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments too. Your voice matters. The truth is, when you're married to someone who hurts you, it's not just a matter of packing up and walking away. It's about surviving. Every single day becomes a careful balancing act, trying not to say the wrong thing, trying not to trigger another outburst. You learn to live in fear, and that fear controls everything you do. Asking for a divorce nearly cost Jill her life. So imagine what she feared might happen if she called the police or filed for a restraining order. What if Carl came after her with more fury? What if the system didn't protect her? These weren't just what-ifs. They were real possibilities that she had to think about every day. And let's not forget, Carl wasn't just hurting Jill. He was hurting their kids too. Every time he screamed, every time he broke something, every time he threatened their mom, they were watching. They were learning to be afraid. Jill knew that one wrong move could put all of them in even more danger. Escaping wasn't just brave. It took strength in every possible way, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and physically. However, on the 25th of August, 2001, Jill finally sat down with Carl and explained her plans. She told him she was moving to Basildon with their children, intending to put the house up for sale and start over. As expected, Carl accused her of having an affair, just like he had done countless times in the past. However, it was no secret that Carl himself had been unfaithful numerous times, including having an affair with a female colleague. Jill had even confronted this woman over the phone about it. Jill had also confided in her sister-in-law, Caroline, revealing that Carl's infidelity had pushed her into an affair with one of her own colleagues. This was a secret Jill had been carrying for a while. But now the truth was out. A few days later, Jill grew increasingly worried about Carl's behavior. On the 27th of August, Jill called Caroline again, expressing her fear that Carl had lost control. She also suspected he was secretly recording her private conversations, both at home and in the car. The tension between them was reaching a boiling point, and on that same evening, Carl made an unusual purchase at a local store. He bought a long piece of rope. When the store assistant asked why he needed it, Carl claimed it was for moving heavy furniture. But Jill knew something was off. On the 28th of August, after finishing his work shift, Carl went to a local pub for a drink with colleagues. Later, he stopped at a store to pick up groceries. By the time he returned home, the neighborhood was quiet. He spoke briefly with a neighbor before heading inside. It was then that the nightmare began. After watching an episode of The Bill, a popular police drama, Carl exploded in a fit of violent rage. Neighbors reported hearing shouting and a loud argument coming from the Bluestone house. Then moments later, Jill's 6-year-old daughter Jessica appeared at a neighbor's door, panic-stricken and crying, saying, "Daddy's banging my head on the wooden floor. My daddy is hitting my mommy. Please call the police. I don't want daddy to kill mommy." Jessica cried, her terrified voice ringing out in the still night air. Her words sent chills through the neighbors, who immediately called the police. By the time the police arrived at the Bluestone home, they were met with a scene so horrific it would haunt them forever. Jill's body was found lifeless on the kitchen floor, brutally murdered with 13 hammer blows to the back of her head. Her 3-year-old son, Henry, was discovered at the bottom of the stairs, badly injured, with 10 hammer wounds to his head. The injuries on his hands showed that he had tried to defend himself against his father's attack. Baby Chandler, just 18 months old, was found in his crib, suffering from 6 blows to his forehead. Despite being rushed to the hospital, Chandler's injuries were too severe, and he tragically died. Jill's 7-year-old son, Jack, was discovered alive but severely injured. He was curled up in a fetal position on the bottom bunk of his bed. Jack was quickly brought to the hospital, along with his younger sister Jessica, who had bravely run for help. When paramedics reached Jessica, she was in a state of shock, repeatedly saying, "I can't get Mummy out of my mind." Her words filled with grief and terror. Both children were rushed to the hospital, with Jack in critical condition. Meanwhile, neighbors had reported hearing strange noises coming from the garage. When police entered with flashlights, they found Carl hanging from a beam inside the garage. It was clear that Carl had taken his own life, a tragic end to a horrifying act of violence. Carl's death meant that he would never stand trial for the brutal murders of his wife and children, but an inquest was held to investigate the events leading up to that night. The inquest revealed disturbing details that raised questions about how the situation had been handled by the authorities. Jill had reported 4 separate incidents of domestic violence to the police, yet no action had been taken. In the first incident, Jill contacted the police after Carl had physically assaulted her during an argument. She had visible bruises on her arms and told officers that Carl had pinned her to the wall. She also mentioned that this wasn't the first time he had hurt her, but it was the first time she felt brave enough to make a formal report. However, instead of taking action, the officers noted it as a domestic disagreement and left the scene without arresting Carl or even issuing a warning. No follow-up was made. The second report came a few months later. This time, Carl had thrown a heavy household object. Some sources say it was a chair, at Jill in front of one of their children. The child had been terrified and screaming, but again when Jill called the police, the officers did not make an arrest. She told them she feared the violence would get worse, but the incident was again downplayed. Though it was more serious than the first, officers allegedly advised Jill to give it time or seek counseling. No protective measures were taken. The third and fourth incidents were the most serious. On both occasions, had made formal complaints and even provided photographic evidence of her injuries, as well as statements from neighbors who had heard or witnessed Carl shouting, throwing things, and threatening Jill. In one instance, a neighbor told officers that they had seen Carl dragging Jill by her hair into the house. The police actually acknowledged the seriousness of these cases and forwarded them to the Crown Prosecution Service, which is responsible for deciding whether charges should be brought in criminal cases. But even though 2 full case files were submitted to the CPS, no charges were filed. The reasoning? It was claimed that there was insufficient evidence, or that Jill might not be a reliable witness because she had once briefly returned to Carl after an incident. No one seemed to consider that victims of abuse often feel trapped or manipulated, and may stay out of fear or financial dependence. Even more frustrating was the fact that despite having 4 reports on file and 2 investigations that reached the CPS, no restraining order was issued, no social worker was assigned, and no safety plan was put in place. The police failed to treat Jill's situation as a high-risk domestic violence case, even though it clearly was. She was never offered a referral to a women's shelter, and Carl was never required to attend anger management or counseling. Domestic violence advocacy groups were quick to condemn the police for failing to take the necessary actions to protect Jill and her children. The groups argued that if Carl had received counseling or proper intervention, this horrific event might have been avoided. They also highlighted that Jill and her children had been failed by the very system that was meant to protect them. The inquest concluded that Carl Bluestone's behavior had gone unchecked, and the tragic events that unfolded could have been prevented with the right support and intervention. Time and time again we see stories like this, where the signs were there, but the system failed to act. But this time, it feels even more tragic, because Jill didn't just have to fight her abuser. She had to fight the very system that was supposed to protect her. And in the end, that system let her down.